Hi, I'm Sven. I'm the CEO of Gitpod, and I have the pleasure of talking with Erich Gamma today. Erich had, through the last 25 years, a huge impact on developer experience. He wrote the design patterns book that came out in 1995 as part of the Gang of Four. He co-wrote the JUnit library, which is, kind of the the version that sparked the idea of XUnit libraries around the globe. So he wrote that together with Kent Beck, who's also popular for the extreme programming and agile methodologies work he had been working on. And so that's already quite interesting and very impactful, the design patterns work and JUnit. But the real work that Erich is focusing on is IDEs and developer tools generally. So the first one I want to mention is Eclipse. Eclipse, when it came out, it was a really important milestone. It was a very superior IDE with very nice Java support. It actually was the first IDE, if I remember correctly, that had a real compiler built in an incremental compiler, because the team understood in order to support really good language tooling, you need to know a lot about the language, right? And so that was an important design decision there. And of course, also it was very, and still is very extensible, which made it a great platform for the open source, all the open source products that came out of that and projects. And so today, Eclipse is still a very thriving open source community, and all of that is, based on the initial work that Erich and his team did. 10 years ago, then, Erich and his team moved on to Microsoft in order to, again, work on a code editor there. Fast forward to today, we see VS Code, very, very thriving project with over 50% market share in the developer community, according to the 2019 Stack Overflow survey, so probably even more today. Very excited to welcome Erich Gamma. Hi, Erich. How are you?
Pretty good. Hi, Sven. Glad to be here and finally meet you after all these years of almost mutual collaboration from remote.
Yeah, it's very exciting for me as well. So really good to see you. So today in this conversation, I would like to go through your past, the achievements you made, the contributions you've made to developer experience. And in the intro, I already talked about design patterns, which is huge, and also the JUnit stuff and so on.
I still love design patterns. Don't.
Yeah, you do.
I love them like you love your children, right?
All right. But I would like to focus more on Eclipse and VS Code, the work you did there, which is also both full of design patterns if you look into the code. So actually, I think besides the Gang of Four book that I think I read that pretty in the beginning of my career, I also read the design patterns in Eclipse book that came out later.
Contributing to Eclipse, we can.
Yeah, contributing to Eclipse, yeah. So talking about Eclipse, so I mean, Eclipse has been around, I'm not entirely sure, I think 25 years or something. Yeah.
When
so a long time.
When I left IBM, it was more than 10 years. Yeah. So now it's 10 years Microsoft. It's more than 20 years.
Wow. Yeah. And it has, it has really changed the IDE landscape big time for me, and for all the developers. I think I jumped on it on version 1.0. Before that, I used NetBeans. So I started out with Java back in the days. And I mean, it was, overall a really decent experience. And so my first question would be, what from your perspective are, the key things that made Eclipse successful?
I guess it really promoted the idea IDEs tools have to be extensible, right? And Eclipse came up what I still think is a nice plugin model, right? So you declare an extension declaratively, or in Eclipse it did in XML, But you said what the contribution does, and kind of the tool then does the rest, right? It manages it. You contribute a command, but the tool manages it. And also, thanks to this declarative description, the tool can load an extension on demand, right? Only when needed. And that's something that I think is still a valid pattern if you want today, right? So that's still survived, having a clear model that where you describe an extension, and then the tool based on that manages the extension without having to give too much details of its internals, right? You don't do a contribution to a UI element of the tool. You contribute something like a command or an editor, but the tool manages how it's presented to the user. Right? This is still the model we use in VS Code today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that is the the extensibility part, and Eclipse has become really a platform for all sorts of things. Like I've been working in that community and doing consulting basically on Eclipse, right? So there were a lot of clients who built their products based on that and so on. So this extensibility is definitely an important bit, but also for just Java developers, like for end users, it's just the user experience. I think it had a few features that were, changing how we work. I think one thing is just a decent incremental, incremental compilation stuff. So
that's okay. That of course came from the previous implementation of the tool, right? The first Java tool that the company that got acquired by IBM did was implemented in Smalltalk, right? And Smalltalk is known for incrementality, right? You write the method, you save it, and you run it even while you're in the middle of debugging it, right? And this has led to this whole mindset from the beginning, right? You want to get the same model for Java as you had for Smalltalk, right? But the second iteration was we didn't want to use, like as in Smalltalk, a repository where everything was stored in kind of some database. You want to be open for files, right? And Eclipse was then taking ideas from Visual Age for Java was the name, right? Which was implemented in Smalltalk and bring it over to an all in Java implemented world. But the incrementality, the mindset, right? Hot code replace, if you remember that, which Eclipse had. This is just from the genes of the developers that use Smalltalk.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that paved the way for these very excellent Java IDEs. I like for Java, I always thought about, okay, the language is not really super convenient, so the tools need to make up for it a bit, right? Yeah, compensate. Yeah. And I mean, I think Eclipse contributed a lot to this path, right? I mean, this also has downsides. I think it's generally something that the Java world maybe is a bit tool heavy, I think, or has been in the past. It became a bit more lean, and there were also some perceptions for Eclipse over the years that it became a bit bloated and so on. What are some of the design decisions you look at in Eclipse that you would kind of regret or would change or would do differently?
I think at the time we made it, I think we did it all right. But when we look back, then what we learned, then it would change things, right? That's why we did things different in VS Code. And one lesson was, our life as Eclipse platform developers would have been so much easier if extensions just don't run in the same process as the tool. Right, Eclipse, you had Java as Java implementation language. And Java provided you support in a nice way to dynamically load code in the same address space, right? You had class loaders, all the things, which was beautiful, right? But what we underestimated is just the side effect that extensions can have when they run in the same address space, right? They can make startup slow. They can make that you don't save, that you can save because it's in the same process. If an extension runs amok, right, I cannot press save anymore. And I think the mindset just to load everything in the same process almost implied you have to write everything in Java, which in retrospect, right, is a bit of a handicap when you think of different language support, right? So you don't want to write a C++ extension in Java, which actually my team did. Actually, someone from my team did the first C++ extension all in Java. But it would be much nicer if you are more open, you can do the tools you want to implement the language and not be constrained by having run everything on top of a Java runtime. In hindsight, right, you could have done it for Eclipse as well, right? And today you see Eclipse can consume language service and so on. It was just the mindset was everything gets loaded into the same process. And of course, that's the fastest way to integrate, right? No IPC, nothing. But today, as you see with VS Code, IPC and RPC, it's just not a problem, right? And we JSON stringify stuff, and it's still fast enough, right? When you imagine, right, I press Control Space, something goes over to another process, and the results come back as a big JSON file, which you again parse and show them. And just we had this mindset, you have to run in the same process. No, a function call is so much more efficient than an IPC call. But it was a lot of protection for you as a platform, right? So we got hammered. Eclipse is slow. Also because you're running, startup is slow, right? Or another thing is, no, you cannot protect your internal implementation because you're running the same address space. Someone can reach to you and call a function which is not API, right? And if it's a product like an IBM product that does it, and then you change it and break them, then it's pretty stressful for a platform developer because they come and say, hey, you broke us, you cannot change that. But if you think further, right, this basically handcuffs you. You cannot do anything if you cannot change your internals. For that reason, I think this single process architecture of Eclipse is something you really want to change as you move to VS Code.
Okay. Yeah. So talking about the difference between Eclipse and VS Code and the extension model. That is one clear difference. And then this process and communication over JSON RPC that VS Code does, the separation. I mean, it also helps really what you just said with having a stable API surface and not allowing others to go and call any internal APIs, which is a compromise for some. It is, you only have this API and you try to shoehorn everything into it. But of course, for the maintainer and for the VS Code team, this is obviously makes the job much simpler. And I would say also for a user, in terms of discoverability, it is much simpler to understand what can I do by looking at one API file that is currently, like, it is very long, but I have one place where I can look at what's available, what can I do.
You have folding, right? Even it's long, you can fold, right? So
yeah, right. But it is a single place rather than the Eclipse architecture is more like, everything is a plugin, and you would just look around and see what kind of extension points does this plugin expose and what can I use, which also results in a network of dependencies with different version constraints and so on, which is very complex. And so I rarely see with VS Code, big issues with version constraints and so on. Why is that?
Well, okay, I think what you mentioned, right, there is these two modularity approaches, right? One is the one from Eclipse, everything is a plugin, and basically the modularity of a plugin is the same as you structure the system, right? So you have packages, public packages, private packages, right? So it's you're very close to the implementation in a way, right? So the way that VS Code is implemented shines through to the API because we just exposed the plugins and their APIs, right? And that was something we wanted to change, right? You want to say, we want to keep extension authoring very simple. And we found like VS Code internal is very similar to Eclipse, right? It's based on components, you have service injection and all this magic, right? But we thought for extension authors, the hurdle is too much, right? So you don't want that to have to deal with service injection. And that's why we said we want to really have a designed API from the ground up, which TypeScript allows us to nicely describe, right? And then build on that. And also given that we're on extension in a separate process, it's pretty natural, right? That then this API becomes basically the RPC between the core and the process that runs the extensions. So we extensions have a version, but we don't allow that it can dependencies on a particular version of an extension, right? So that's just something we don't support, and it wasn't a problem up to now. Based on the thing, we want to move forward, right? We want that that extensions always get auto-updated and move forward with VS Code, right? We don't want that all of a sudden an extension can say, but I depend on other extension that monopolizes that. So we kept the model that really is based on you update to the latest, and you cannot basically constrain, right? So you always have to move forward, and you can still express an API dependency version, but the API dependency is on the whole API, right? It's not on a subset of the API, right? If you, in VS Code, you define kind of the engine version, which is basically the API version of VS Code core. And that simplifies things dramatically.
Mm. Okay.
We still support that an extension can expose API, and some of our extensions do it, like the Git extension exposes API and so on. But yeah, typically, it's just much simpler, right? Which also means it's not as powerful as Eclipse, right? Because in Eclipse, if the same modularity to extension authors, they have the same power as the Eclipse authors, which in VS Code is not the case, and it was intentional not the case, because you wanted to have more control of the core and kind of more separation between extensions and the core, right? This was just this lesson learned. You want to protect the core from extension as much as possible. Which also means for us, we have a pressure, right? We have to continuously make the API more powerful. The nicely designed API, right? You call it, I guess, the main API, as you said. This one API, we have to continuously make it more powerful, that you can do as powerful things with this API as we can do in the core implementation, right? So the pressure is there. And if you look at what we did over the last 5 years, we have continuously invested in API, make more powerful, like custom editors, right? You can now define your own editor, which doesn't have to be a text editor. And that's all based on this desire of getting on par with a model where everybody can do the same as the tool authors, but through the API, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
I mean, I clearly see that, but I also think like this limitation is a good thing because it narrows the scope of what VS Code is for. If comparing it with Eclipse again, Eclipse has become more than just an IDE over the years. It has become this RCP framework running.
The worst thing on earth, right? How can you think that an IDE platform can be a good application platform, right? Poor application developers, right?
Yeah, but it has been possible, and so because everything was so generic, and then it was even there was forces making it even more generic because we wanted to support this and that, and then out of a sudden a product or a code base can do all the things instead of being focused on just being an IDE, and so to that end, I think this is. Yeah, it is a deliberate decision for VS Code, and I think it makes sense to extend the lifespan of it because software systems have this natural tendency to grow and grow and grow. You don't remove things. Yeah. I mean, talking about that, what do you do about this? Like you just said, you add APIs all the time.
APIs add all the time to make more powerful extensions, right? So that. The idea is the added functions should come through extensions and not in the core, right? So with extensions, you can turn VS Code, which is an editor, into an IDE. But VS Code, the core itself, should not be an IDE. right? But you want to enable that if you really want, through extensions, you can build an IDE. Over that, we also try to stick to our values, right? And our values are out of the box. VS Code is a fast, lightweight editor. We care a lot about performance, right? So startup performance, we not only care, we measure, right? We continuously measure our startup performance. That helps us also with the bloat, right? Less code execute on startup is a good thing. But then we really want to outsource a lot of the features and functionality into extensions, right? And be careful to not just bundle lots of stuff into the core to make it more and more fat. Of course, we grow. It's amazing how much code a team of 20 developers can produce, right? If you see the graph, yeah, that's how it is. But the performance focus gives me confidence, right, that we have some probes, right, that we know where it really will go bad. And so far, startup, we keep the performance, even though we evolve and grow. Yeah. I wish I had a clear and simple solution to that, but it's continuous engineering, right? That's, I guess, all I can say.
It is, yeah. Probably also staying true to your initial focus, the values, and being good at saying no and externalizing certain things.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's hard, but I think that's a dilemma that every software engineer has, actually, because we all work on these, tools and.
But also, what I think of a multi-process architecture is less vulnerable to bloat than a single process architecture, right? Given that we run singing language servers in a separate process and so on, right? Then it's more distributed across multiple processes, not just one monster in the middle. You really have it more balanced, right? And one funny story was kind of someone that wasn't aware that VS Code is a multi-process architecture. He just look at in Windows Task Manager and saw the memory footprint of VS Code, right? Very impressive how small it is. And of course, I said, yes, but we have more than one process, right? And if you add them up, then yeah.
Look at that Java language server.
Java languages need memory, right? The language needs memory. ASTs, right? There are beasts which require memory. And yeah, but we don't have those in the core. So this helps us to keep lean, right? Because we come up with the lean core and then extensions get loaded, which helps us also, right?
Yeah, I mean, the language server protocol, as well as the debug adapter protocol, they are really, very important steps, I think, making it possible to stop working on, as you said before, a C++ language implementation in Java, which doesn't make sense. And then another one maybe in JavaScript or TypeScript or whatnot. When you designed this, came up with the idea of these protocols, did you think about, that this would maybe be universal applicable, or is that somehow important to you, that idea?
No, remember, VS Code came out basically late in the game, right? There was Sublime, there was Atom, and they provided what an editor does, coloring and so on, right? So we said, okay, we're late to the game. How can it be a player, right? So, well, we have to add value. And one of the values is to go beyond syntax coloring. But then we also acknowledged, right? So we are a small niche player. How can we get other language providers implemented support? If it's just for VS Code, it's not appealing. So from the beginning, you want to be open, right? By having the language server protocol, another editor, another tool can also benefit from the language brains implemented in a language server. So from the beginning, you wanted to be open. Openness was important, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Which is consistent with our other approach, right? Transparency and openness. That's what the key values.
Yeah, I mean, that has been the key success indicator for editors or IDEs, an ecosystem, a diverse ecosystem where the whole community would, build on stuff and on extensions and so on. And yeah, so you wanted to make it very easy for existing language implementations to hook them up with VS Code. today it looks more like, everyone implements their language implementations behind the language server protocol, or at least when you start now, you should do that, and then you can reuse that in other IDEs, right? Is there some, like, how do you manage this process basically that, you don't want to over abstract, I guess. IDEs are also different somewhat, some content assist might have different information, and I guess there is demand from other editors regarding the language server protocol.
That's a challenge, right? So to find the common ground between different editor hosts, if you want. And the way how we design the protocol, actually I maintain it's mostly one Dirk Bäumer is mostly, he's the specifier of the protocol. And of course the input comes from the VS Code extension API, right? That's the first level of experience where we had it. And then of course we can abstract it further. And one idea of the VS Code language API is that based on data providers, right? So the model extension model is, as an extension author, all you do is you provide data that then the tool consumes, right? Like there's a completion provider, right? That's in the API. Mm-hmm. The completion provider is in charge. Give me the completion items, which is data, right? Gets it back, and then it's managed again by VS Code core. So this gives us some level of confidence, right? That this data model really helps us. And then LSP defines the corresponding protocol on that. We usually always try to first have an implementation in the VS Code extension API, and then we abstract it in LSP. That's a principle that Dirk uses and always reminds me at, right? That because otherwise we want to not the data merge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, makes sense. Regarding the extension model, we talked about they are different between Eclipse and VS Code, very different actually. Do you think Eclipse would have been more successful, if that is important at all? I don't know. With an extension model like VS Code has now?
To me, it's more like a generational thing, right? So the Eclipse is kind of some first-class extension model, and with VS Code, we could benefit from all these experiments and build a second generation of an extension model, right? Which makes it very easy for extension authors. Also, we have lots more small extensions, right, in the marketplace. And just when I look at the numbers, and I just did that before because I know you want to talk about extensions. I saw in the Eclipse marketplace, you find 2,000 extensions. In the VS Code marketplace, you find 25,000, right? So in a way, with this model, I think we had success. But Eclipse could have had the same success with that. I don't know, right?
Yeah, I mean, if quantity is an indicator for that.
There's a long tail of extensions. I totally agree, right? There's a long tail of extensions. And of course, the 100 most popular extensions, right, the curve, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Quality is not the only thing, but the extensions have to be high quality. And the better the platform is, the better the quality of the extensions, right? That's what also something we had in mind. As you protect the platform, we also want to give an API that helps implementing quality extensions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think Eclipse would have definitely been very different today with a VS Code extension model.
But look at the history, right? At that time, the extension model was based, you load things in the same process, right?
Yeah.
That's NetBeans was like that. That was the mindset at the time. Then if you look architectures, right? Browsers were similar, right? Then came Chromium, which then also moved to a multiprocess architecture, right? And I think just as a point in time, I think how we design things.
How did you get started with VS Code? Like 10 years ago, when you moved to Microsoft with your team, what was the plan back then?
Well, the plan was continuous steering, right? It was not, you should not think you have a master plan for 10 years. When we started 10 years ago, I took some of my VS Code Eclipse team members with me, but also some fresh brains, which was good. And we started with building a web IDE. a side product of this web IDE effort was Monaco Editor, which is very popular, right? That was a success. The web IDE was less successful because we only got about 3,000 daily users and something. That's a number inside Microsoft that you're not relevant with this number of users, right? So there are many reasons for that. But then we decided, yeah, Monaco Editor is nice, but what can we do, right? So, and then 4 years into the project, we decided to pivot from a web IDE to a desktop tool. Because we found, born in the web developers, they use many languages, they love Sublime, they like the command line, right? And you cannot just make them happy with a tool like Visual Studio. And moreover, Microsoft has transformed itself into any company, right? Any language, any platform, any tool, whatever. For Azure, right, makes total sense. For a cloud provider, right, you don't want to be limited to only Windows, whatever. So it became at that time important to have a cross-platform tool for developer. Otherwise, you kind of are not relevant to developers, right? Which includes even a tool that runs on Linux. And then came the idea, yeah, we just run what we had from the web IDE on the desktop, thanks to Electron. We could do that in a reasonable way. And then we could do the first demo running VS Code on Linux, right? And everybody, Microsoft was proud. Now we have a Linux-based tool, right? So this was kind of 4 years into that. And then I think 5 years ago, we released it in a preview. But then also clear to us from the beginning, we cannot do all this long tail of language support ourselves, right? And if you want to get there, we need two things. We need an extension model and we need to be open source. And we got that 6 months later after preview, which was very compressed 6 months in our lives, but we got it. And then along came LSP we talked about, then came remote, right? That here, since we can run extensions remotely, we can, in a separate process, we can also run extensions remotely, right? This idea was, it's a protocol, so we should be able to do that. And we were able to do that. And that then enabled us to come back to the browser, right? So with that we can run extensions remotely, we can then bring basically VS Code back in the browser, which closes a nice loop, right? That we started in a web IDE, and now we run back in the browser, and then with GitHub code spaces, right? There's a backend that does that. So that's a nice loop. It's one of the many loops we had, right? Another loop is Java, right? So VS Code now supports Java. The way it supports it, it uses the Eclipse Java implementation, which is based on LSP, right? So basically,
yeah,
still all with us. Yeah, so it's great. This was really great. If you look at the last 10 years, it was fun how many loops we had, how many pivots we had, and it was just continuous steering, right? LSP was just out of the need. Wait, we're late to the game. How can you get lots of language support that goes beyond syntax coloring? And then we did LSP. How we can do the same with debugger? Then we did debug adaptive protocol, right? It's really, I would say, continuous steering and listening.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, really a cool journey, I would say, and
Definitely
a tremendous access.
Definitely a fun one, I said, sorry.
Yeah, okay. And a tremendous success, right? I mean, this is now over 50% market share. Like that was 2019, probably it's already 60 or so. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I myself use that. We use it in Gitpod, obviously. So it's, everywhere, basically becoming really a standard, the new VI Emacs thing or so. I don't know. Hopefully it also, survives the test of time, like those two editors. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
A last question would be, what are the future developments in VS Code you are most excited about?
Well, I love all developments, right? I will not say which one of more or less. Also, as you are transparent, right? The roadmap of what we plan to the next 12 months, we just made it available. And obviously, one thing what is there, which I still find exciting, and we share the same passion, I guess, you and I in that, right? To give developers tools but they don't have to worry about configuration of the prerequisites, right? And that's Gitpod. And we work together with GitHub and Visual Studio team on code spaces. So this will still take some of our time. The web is still challenging, right? iPad support, all the things. Now that you also use VS Code, I guess we will get help from you also to make iPad support great, right? So that's still, I think it's exciting. And it's also, I really like the work you are doing there, right? Because it's great to not be the only one with space. And yeah, I'm also happy with the progress they made on the back end. The team was really great. That's code spaces. Related to code spaces, something that came a little bit out of this work is now code space requires that you have a backend, right? A container that runs things. How far can you push things by being browser only, right? That's another thing that we want to do, and we did a little bit of that already in code spaces. So one example I can give you, right? A Vim extension is written that for each keystroke, you send something to the extension and the extension will do a command, interpret the command and so on. And if you do that remotely, right, then you have some round tripping and latency. So what we did for code spaces and which has led to this path is that we can run now like the Vim extension in the browser in a web worker. Right, so we always try to find new locations for our extension host, right? We can run in a Docker container, in SSH box, in WSL, and now we can also run it in a web worker in the browser. This has an interesting potential, right? How far can you push that? Other things, notebooks we have started, right? Jupyter, very popular, so we want to kind of evangelize that for Jupyter, but other things that can benefit from this metaphor. And it's just amazing, just for teaching and things, how far and powerful this metaphor is, right? A notebook with cells, and you run them and you can share them. So that's something we will continue to invest heavily. And last but not least, what you see on our roadmap is security, right? So it's just the fact that developers are great attack target, and developers are not always very careful, I guess, right? They have no fear to run code or whatever, but I think that's, as developers become more attractive for attackers, that's something we have to do, right? And that's not only protecting for extensions, but even, that's something we work on right now, but even when you open a folder, right? Someone tells you, hey, try this sample. You clone it and you run it. Of course, I can make that this sample runs code only by opening in the IDE. So we have to really protect developers or educate them also more that they're aware of this potential danger, right? So that's the whole security at the folder workspace level, and then comes also the security at extension level, right? So we'll invest heavily in the marketplace that will play a key role in that, right? That you can say, I only want to install extensions from trusted providers, that they are signed, all these things you do to increase kind of protection of developers from malicious attacks.
Yeah.
So that's a big effort we'll do.
And it's super challenging to do that in a way that doesn't do too much compromises on the experience, right? On the developer experience. Like, you don't want to have all the alerts all the time. Do you really want to do this and add this
That's
host?
why the hope is that we can do it once at a level of VS Code, so that not each tool has to do it, right? Not each extension should have to ask for, hey, actually, my extension, I potentially run code on your workspace. So we want to have one UI that does it to reduce the number of time.
Yeah.
A common way to do it. So yeah.
Yeah, definitely super important. Also, moving development towards the cloud helps, but also has new challenges at the same time, but on both sides, I would say, security-wise.
Usually moving code to the cloud, people mix things up in two challenges, right? One is that you really have this container where you run your software stack, and then often people only think you can only connect through a browser to that, right? And I think you can also do cloud-based development with a desktop tool that doesn't run in the browser, right? And that's now an option that VS Code can provide, right? You run VS Code on the desktop and you connect to a cloud cloud-hosted container. So
Yeah.
that you don't have to adopt two things at once, right? You don't have to adopt cloud-hosted development stacks and web IDEs, right? So this is two new things you have to adopt, and sometimes one at a time, or at least have the option, is a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, pretty exciting times ahead of us, Erich.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks for the conversation. It was
Sure.
my pleasure.
Talk to you.
Have a great day.
Same to
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.